Good morning, everyone. Joining us here in Washington, D.C. Good afternoon, good evening to those of you joining us from around the world. I'm very pleased to welcome you all to the Bretton Woods Committee's 2022 annual meeting. We have a very important week of discussions this week and look forward to everyone's engagement and participation. The theme of this year's annual meeting is confronting changes, and we have no shortage of those facing the world right now. We kick off this annual meeting against a turbulent economic and geopolitical backdrop. Global growth is slowing, food and energy prices are soaring, inflation is the highest it's been in my lifetime. Many countries are facing acute debt challenges. The pandemic continues to disrupt daily life, and the war in Ukraine is overshadowing everything. So many have likened today's challenges to the period leading up to the world wars, and many have called for a new Bretton Woods moment, just as we had in 1944, to rethink the framework and the principles that guide international cooperation going forward. We're going to dive into all of this throughout this week, and we're going to start today with a panel of experts who are going to discuss some of the fragilities that we've seen in global supply chains over the past couple of years and how we can make them more robust and resilient going forward. Before I turn it over to them, I just want to remind the audience that we always reserve time for questions. So if you have a question, we ask that you please submit them through the Q&A function in Zoom. We'll collect these throughout the panel. And then when it's time for Q&A, we'll go to individuals and we'll unmute your microphones so that you can pose your questions directly to the speakers. I'm now quickly going to introduce our speakers and then I'll turn it over to them. Helen Zhao is the Managing Director and Chief Economist for Greater China and the Head of Asia Economics Research at Bank of America Merrill Lynch. Helen also serves on our BWC Advisory Council, and we're so pleased to have her leadership there. So thank you for joining us today, Helen. Denis Redonnet is Deputy Director General for Trade and Chief Enforcement Officer at the European Commission. Very pleased to have you with us today, Denis. Looking forward to hearing your perspective. And John Drake will be joining us shortly. He is the President for Supply Chain Policy at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. We'll get him on the line soon. And finally, moderating today's conversation is Jennifer Westacott. And Jennifer is the CEO of the Business Council of Australia. So she's joining us at a pretty unfriendly hour over there. Many thanks, Jennifer, for joining us. And she is also a new Bretton Woods Committee member. So pleased to have you as part of our group, Jennifer. And I will turn it over to you to kick off today's discussion.
Well, thanks, Emily, and hi, everybody. We have a custom and practice of respect to our traditional owners of the land wherever we meet. Tonight, I'm here in the south part of New South Wales, and that's the Walbunja people of the Yuin Nation. And it is our custom and practice to pay respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Obviously, we're meeting today under the auspice of the Bretton Woods Committee. This is an important organisation dedicated to promoting the benefits of multilateralism and finding ways to strengthen the functioning of international financial institutions. I think it's fair to say that the multilateral order following the Second World War has delivered enormous benefits, social and economic, not only to Western countries, but also emerging economies. It's created huge opportunities and mutual gains, but it also has created high degrees of interconnectedness and economic interdependence. So what we'll be discussing today is the strengths and weaknesses of that interdependence in both supply chains, trade, and multilateralism. Just to make sure we're all on the same page, in respect of supply chains, our panel is going to explore the complex issues around supply chains, around availability of materials, logistics, price, the rise of sovereignty, and the rise of sovereign capability. And of course, we'll be talking about the mobilisation of those supply chains through our trade and multilateral relationships. And I think it's fair to say, as Emily said, that our multilateral system has weathered many shocks, but it's now facing a period of great disruption. We're seeing really the convergence of what I call three great forces of disruption. These are the huge geopolitical tensions, including the war in the Ukraine, as well as the China tensions with the US and Australia and other countries, the pandemic, which has heightened weaknesses around sovereign capability, around the institutions which govern our health systems, and certainly in Australia's case, the functioning of federated systems, and of course, the big challenge of climate change and clean energy transition. What we want to do today in this panel is explore the extent to which we're dealing with temporary issues or whether or not those issues have exposed structural weaknesses in our supply chains and multilateral relationships. Let me go to geopolitical tensions first. I mean, obviously the war in Ukraine is front of mind, but we can't forget that there have been simmering and spiking tensions between the West and China for some time. Australia is, of course, in the middle of many of these difficult issues with China. And there's no doubt the geopolitical landscape has dramatically changed over the last 2 decades. But the war in the Ukraine is obviously front of mind. It's exposing many issues which impact on multilateralism and on trade. The functioning of NATO, the interdependency of the European economy, and in particular, the interdependencies of these energy relationships. That's starting to expose a conversation about how fast we should transition to a clean energy future. Some commentators saying we should slow it down, some saying this is exactly why we should speed it up. So many countries now are saying, well, how do we manage that energy transition? The situation in the Ukraine has also exposed those issues that Emily has talked about, big inflation in respect of oil prices and inflation across the economy. If we go to the pandemic, the next big force of change, exposing many weaknesses and many questions about sovereign capability and nationalism, obviously exposing great weaknesses in World Health Organizations. It's also exposed, certainly in Australia, the challenges of federated system as people seek to coordinate the huge health response that's unfolded here in Australia. And then if I turn to the final force of disruption, which is climate change and clean energy transition, and there are 2 issues really driving this. The first is obviously climate events themselves and the huge cost that they impose on economies. We're seeing a rolling series of natural disasters roll out around the world. Here in Australia, we've recently had a major event, and the cost of that one event alone is expected to exceed $10 billion. It's also exposed huge weaknesses in the insurance system itself. The second angle, of course, is the rapid decarbonisation of economies, which is producing new financial products, a rapid shift to reducing emissions, a race to create new carbon technologies, and of course, a big exposure of fossil fuel dependent economies. So today, our panel will look at the supply chains, multilateralism, trade arrangements, and ask those questions. Are we exposing structural problems? Are we dealing with temporary issues? And what realistically can be done about that? So maybe, Helen, I'll start with you, given that we're waiting for John still. Perhaps if you can start by giving us your thoughts on multilateral trade relationships and global supply chains against that backdrop of ongoing disruption. In particular, what's the impact of the current COVID wave and restrictions on China's domestic economy? And what will that impact be on global supply chains? Thanks, Helen.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you for your question. Do you hear the alarm that I'm hearing?
Yes, yes.
Sorry about that. I don't know how to turn it off, but hopefully this would turn off in just a sec.
It's not very intrusive, it's fine.
Okay, finally. So I think thank you for having me here. And thank you for the question, Jennifer. I think for the, for China's role at the moment, I think that COVID has demonstrated how, unpredictable that the whole, supply chain management issues can be. I think at the very beginning when the outbreak came out of Wuhan and China was going through a very major lockdown, for about a month's time between about early Feb of 2020 to early March. People have been saying that, oh my goodness, this is probably the end of China's supply chain story. Since 2018, because of the U.S.-China trade war, many people were already preparing to move their supply manufacturing facilities away from China and more towards Southeast Asia. But then 2020 was, COVID was giving them just one more reason to do so. But interestingly, China had a turn of the event afterwards by actually, locking down the country, combating against such virus and managing to cope through this pandemic crisis relatively well. So by about summertime in 2020, China was actually pretty managing the situation pretty well, I would say. And what we heard anecdotally throughout 2020 to 2021 is that actually more orders have been sent over to China away from for example, one of my friends were actually the head of an auto part manufacturing facility manager, and he has several locations all over the world. One was in Mexico, the other one was in Poland, and the last one in China, serving 3 different continents. But actually in 2021, he told me that the only operation he could have in the summer was actually the one in China. So he diverted all the orders here, and similar stories were happening back then, making China probably becoming a bit complacent, thinking that actually you now see the power that we have here, right? We have a very big market, and we also have very strong supply chains. Which other country can do this? But interestingly, it turned around, in 2022. In the past month or so, we have seen a significant change because of the COVID outbreak in Shanghai and also in the neighboring provinces such as Jiangsu and also Zhejiang. And Shanghai, a 25 million people city, are now going through, the 4th week. Already 3 weeks, the 4th week of lockdowns, and there is no sign that they could potentially be released anytime soon on a grander scale. They only do selective opening up, and only a very small fraction of the companies are allowed to go back to work. So partly people, our clients were asking us all this time as well. So they're saying that, what's the difference between this time, the resurgence and the COVID measures compared to those that you saw before? How come you're more concerned about the supply chain bottlenecks this time around? And I would say this is mainly because that in the past, China was able to manage to bend the curve pretty quickly, and the lockdowns are very local, and it doesn't last more than 5 to 7 days, and therefore the hit was mainly on consumption, especially on services, not on production. Manufacturing, industrial sectors are very good at and very efficient at getting back to schedule by having some makeup hours and working overtime for a few days. But this time around it's different because the lockdown in Shanghai is now also causing the nationwide transportation bottlenecks, and because of the fact that more than 10% of the supply chains for autos, for example, for this industry, is located in Shanghai for the whole nation. Shutting down one city means much more than just having 10% of the parts not being delivered. It could be the very crucial part, and therefore we could be seeing, in the near future, in my view, probably in the next 3 to 6 weeks, very immediate impact on the potentially on the supply chains on a global scale. At the moment, we're seeing it impacting the production already in China. It didn't occur on day one when Shanghai was doing the lockdown. It came around 3 to 4 weeks after that. And now I think that in another 3 to 6 weeks, we probably will see that going to the rest of the world.
Can you just talk also about those other 2 mega trends, clean energy and the war in Ukraine? How are they starting to play out in terms of China's supply chain relationships? But I wanted to come back also on the pandemic, this concept of zero COVID in China and how sustainable that is. I mean, in Australia, I was just looking at the newsfeed then, even the close contact rules in one of the states or 2 of the major states have now been abandoned, and people will not have to isolate if someone in their family has got COVID. So maybe stay with the pandemic for a minute. How sustainable do you think it is to have this zero COVID policy, as much as I understand it, on the kind of capacity to sort of strengthen those manufacturing? And then perhaps talk us through clean energy and the war in the Ukraine. What's that doing in Chinese supply chains?
Yeah. I think for the pandemic, I think currently China is holding on to this COVID-0 policies, and our view is that most likely they will not steer away from that until at least the completion of the 20th Communist Party Congress, which is scheduled to be in the second half of this year, sometime maybe around October or November. So we just cut our GDP growth forecast on China today to 4.2%. In our baseline case, we are saying that the reopening would not take place probably until early 2023. This is because that even if they manage to achieve such a COVID-0 policy, COVID-0 results in Shanghai by mid-May, the problem is that they will see this as a very effective and efficient way of protecting the country, and therefore they will just keep it for longer, not only until the CPC, but also all the way maybe into next year. So why is that the case, right? Your question might be that it's a very different approach compared to the Western, way of treating the COVID these days. The key, I think, are there are two primary differences. I think the first one is that I think China was able to protect its population, the majority of its population, from this particular pandemic, and this at the very beginning served as an asset in terms of supply chain management, right? So just like in 2020 and 2021, people can pretty much live their life and without a mask, just as if nothing happened. But the cause of it was that they actually had the door shut, and many of the senior citizens were at that time not seriously worried about the potential consequences by the time that the door reopens, right? And therefore, the senior vaccination rate is quite low in China. For example, the booster shot rate for those that are above 80 years old are actually, way below 50%. Right. So this it's a good reason why they actually don't want to open up in protection of the senior citizens. But the second reason, I think it's more political, which is before the Communist Party Congress in the fall, which is the most important political event of the whole decade, where President Xi is about to assume his next term. He doesn't necessarily want this kind of unpleasant surprises, right, from a pandemic. So those are the reasons. Coming back to your question on the other two issues, decarbonization was given very top priority last year, to the extent that I think China was probably doing it too much. President Xi has sworn at the UN conference that China will have a 2030 and a 2060 goal. In 2030, China pledges to become carbon neutral, and then it's a carbon peak. And then by 2060, China will become carbon neutral. Such goals are actually pretty aggressive. If you look at China's current carbon consumption, patterns, the trajectory, unless China is transforming completely towards a service-based economy, as most of the DM countries, I don't necessarily see that happening, especially not at this pace. But since it is because President Xi mentioned it, many people think that it must be done. So local governments were actually pushing really aggressively last year, trying to take whatever shortcut that is available to achieve a very aggressive decarbonization goal. And some cities were actually sending out a crazy announcements saying that, oh, instead of 2030, we can do it in 2028. And then Beijing is saying, okay, we can do 2025. And then Wuhan said, okay, we do it in 2022. It's almost a competition. And they have very little idea about what this implies to their local economy. So I think last year there was a kind of a big leap forward for decarbonization in China. But unfortunately, I don't necessarily think that it's continuing this year, mainly because that China has gone through a very dramatic phase of power crunch in September last year, and making them realize that they are probably being too aggressive on these goals. For Ukrainian
I might stop you there, yes. And I might go to Denis first, and then get you to respond to the Ukraine. So Denis, let's go to the European situation now. Give us the big picture here in terms of what's happening, what's exposing in terms of supply chains, interconnectedness of trading relationships, and what, if anything, are the practical solutions? And maybe, Eleanor, has John joined us yet?
Hello, Jennifer. Oh, Emily, go ahead, please.
Yes, I wanted to inform our panelists and our audience that unfortunately John has indicated that he had an unforeseen emergency and will not be able to join today.
Okay.
So we will proceed with the panelists that we have, and unfortunately we'll have to excuse him.
That's okay. All right. So Denis, let's go to you. Let's go to that picture in Europe, and then I'll get Helen to sort of give the China perspective on that.
Sure. Well, thanks a lot, Jennifer. Thanks for having me on the panel today. Indeed, I can give you a bit of a more of a European perspective, also a government perspective. I come, of course, from the public authorities side of things. Look, disruptions we're experiencing big time here in Europe. And it's interesting because you're listing quite naturally climate, emergency, the pandemic, and now more recently, the situation with Ukraine. Let me reverse the order from a European perspective, because you cannot underestimate how much of an existential shock Russia's aggression of Ukraine represents, sitting from the EU's perspective here in Brussels. And not just in terms of the implication it's going to have on the economy and on possibly on economic policies. Maybe I'll say a word on that, but it's a much deeper issue. It's the biggest security threat to us in decades. And it has already led to an unprecedented European response in areas other than the economy: political, financial, humanitarian. I mean, keep in mind, we're absorbing 5 million Ukrainian refugees, basically, at the moment, on the jurisdiction of the European Union and its member states, for example. Now, when it comes to the economic impact and the trade and supply chain exposure that we're experiencing out of this first of the three shocks, I think it's a massive shock on our side. It's, of course, very difficult right now to disentangle many things that are happening, I think, at the same time in terms of trade and investment side in Europe, because you've got the effect of the war itself on production or logistics, especially for Ukraine. You've got the chilling effects of sanctions, sometimes on the financial side, but which in reality have impact on trade and investment flows through difficulties to obtain payment, insurance. You have the actual effect of firms exiting the Russian market on the basis of risk, on the basis of reputation. And then you have more structural effect of the trade and investment sanctions per se, and we've taken very significant, unprecedented forms of economic and trade sanctions, and the Russian counter sanctions as well, which are playing very significantly. And we've experienced out of this, of course, a big test and a big stress in terms of supply chain vulnerabilities on the energy import side, and beyond energy, of course, on more generally in terms of vulnerabilities for the import of commodities, critical raw materials, for example, given the sort of relationship that we have on the European side and the EU side with the Russian economy in particular, as well as to some extent with the economy of Ukraine. Now, that also in terms of policy for us, I think is generating a sort of new economic statecraft, if you want. There is an economic response, an economic policy response that is a bit inevitable given the depth of the shock. I would say that in Europe, in terms of policy, we were basically expecting, as one of our main strategic challenges, a slow and partial decoupling, primarily between the United States and China, and affecting the global economy, the European Union, among others. And instead, what we're shifting towards very rapidly, what we're experiencing right now, is actually a very rapid and probably pretty deep decoupling between us and Russia. So that's the sort of new factor that has come in terms of what that shock represents. Now, I would add to this that this new political and security shock happens on top of a growing awareness that we've been having for several years now on the European side, that we had to adapt to a trade world, an investment world, where which was characterized by growing global geopolitical tensions, having spillover effects on economic and trade relationships, an environment where the multilateral rules-based system that underpinned this was already, frankly, in crisis and in very serious difficulties from our point of view. And a situation where we're seeing a lot of, or rather an increased sort of phenomenon of weaponization of trade and investment links, of those linkages that are then used by states from the perspective of exercising power. Now, you were talking about, practical solutions, adaptations to this. Again, from a European perspective, I would say the following. I think it requires, first of all, us to do no harm, no further harm in terms of policy where it's necessary not to do that. I'm thinking, for example, today about not adding to the global economy's woes things like export restrictions. And you see this in the food and feed global discussion. It's going to be absolutely essential going forward to avoid more problems, including in the global south. It's requiring us, I think, to put much more effort in shoring up the rules-based system, including the rules-based multilateral trading system with the WTO at its center, and doing that by reforming the WTO, and shoring up, plugging the holes that are there as much as we can. And then from our perspective, it also requires, frankly, that we are able to navigate this more power-based than rules-based environment, and equipping ourselves when necessary with a number of autonomous tools. We need, for example, we believe we need as Europeans to be able to push back on things such as economic coercive practices that we're seeing exist. And I was mentioning this question of weaponization of trade and investment, of investment links. It also means working on the resilience of our supply chains. Now, from a European perspective, what is a resilient supply chain? I would say it's a diversified supply chain. It's also a sustainable supply chain, because that is the value that we and population, citizens of Europe, want to bring in terms of global governance. So that's why we've got to be active with our trade and investment policies, network of trade agreements, continuing to negotiate trade opening agreements, focusing on closer partnerships where we have needs for diversification, for example, in terms of raw material relationship. That's why the EU and Australia have, for example, something to talk to each other about in this area very clearly. And working on common dependencies, on allied reshoring, and we're doing that with some big allies. That's the sense of one of the strands of work that we have with the United States under the new Trade and Technology Council that's been established by the leadership of the EU and the US. And in the middle of this, we need the rules-based system to address the other global challenges, because we need a rules-based system to address the climate change challenge. We believe, for example, we should be integrating sustainability considerations in the agenda of the WTO, much more than is currently the case today, above and beyond the sort of agendas that are already there, for example, an agreement on fishery subsidies reduction. And we need a global system of rules to address not just the current pandemic, but also future pandemic. So I think that's how we see things in terms of how these shocks are developing, and what we think we need to do from a policy perspective in order to continue to maintain a system, an order which helps us to cushion, absorb, and hopefully go beyond the succession of shocks that we have also been experiencing here in Europe.
Thanks, Denis. Helen, get you to comment on Denis' points from a European perspective, how you see that the war in Ukraine, the sorts of things that Denis has been talking about, how China's going to respond to that. And Emily, if you're comfortable to sort of come into the conversation as well, I'd love you to give a bit of a US perspective if you're comfortable as well. Helen?
Sure. I think at the moment, China is still trying to keep Russia at arm's length. They're not necessarily trying to be in the same camp, and nor are they interested in being pushed into that camp involuntarily. But I think that China also understands that if Russia has significant challenges and or fails to keep its own kind of pride in this war, then potentially I think the world that we will be facing will be very different from today's, and therefore China also sees the benefit of not letting Russia fail. And so there is the bottom line that China has drawn, which is they're not necessarily going to offer military help, but they are going to continue with the commercial trade. So if that is the case, China would probably be exposing itself to some secondary sanction risks. So China understands that, and now obviously with the wider than expected sanctions across the board, China knows that these are potentially also can be hurtful of its own industries. So China, I think, will be quite careful. For example, when it comes down to the SWIFT system and the Chinese banks, especially the bigger ones, international ones, are super careful not to be caught in the middle of this, facilitating trade with Russia. So many people were talking about the Klamai Bank, which is the so-called the Bank of Kunlun, that it later transformed into since 2014. It was used primarily to facilitate trade with with those that are offline, and therefore people are largely speculating that this could be the template that China would adopt, going forward with Russia as well, using an important bank as the intermediary, and continue to import from Russia and export the necessary goods. When it comes down to the trade relationship between the two, China runs a small surplus. Russia runs a small trade surplus over China. This is probably because Russia used to import a lot more from European countries, but going forward, that is harder to predict if that will continue to be the case. China probably can benefit from some long-term contracts they had already signed with Russia by natural gas and also crude oil. And hopefully that China would not necessarily be seen as the conduit to pass on certain product that Russia wouldn't be able to import itself, or to pass on Russia's raw materials to other countries. I think that we will see probably a little bit more of a faster development of the bilateral trade, but not to the extent that China thinks it will jeopardize its global market.
Right. Emily, do you want to come in and give some observations from the US perspective, how this disruption that we've been talking about today, how that's starting to play out in the US?
Yeah, sure, Jennifer. And this is supply chains certainly are not my area of expertise, but I will share some I think thoughts from kind of the geopolitical and the world, the global governance perspective. I think I see the war in Ukraine as really accelerating this decoupling that we have been discussing for a few years now between the U.S. and China. As the situation has evolved, I think that we've seen that playing out. And in my opinion, that decoupling and that bifurcation is the ultimate worst outcome, and what we would really hope to avoid. I think as the Bretton Woods Committee, as an institution whose mission is to promote multilateralism and to promote international cooperation, we see the fallout of that decoupling as really being a significant risk to the global economy. And as you all have, probably seen, our Secretary of Treasury, Secretary Yellen, gave a speech this week where she coined a new phrase called friend shoring. So in terms of talking about supply chains and diversification, the U.S. position now has been to sort of link our national security interests with our trade policy. With that speech is what she has sort of laid out. And she has said we need further diversification with our allied countries and with countries who share the same principles as we do. So I think that kind of sets the tone a little bit for how the U.S. is thinking about this going forward. And in my perspective, I'm not sure that's that's going to help us in terms of this avoiding the decoupling scenario that we're talking about. I mean, it seems to really be aligned along the lines of thinking that there will be sort of this world order where there's two economic blocks based upon two different political philosophies. So those are a few of my comments there, Jennifer.
Oh,
Hope
great.
those were helpful.
That's great. I'll come back to a couple of those things, but Denise, can I just go back to you, because I'd be interested in your views about those two systems operating, and how does Europe kind of operate if we kind of have this bifurcated system. But I'd be also just want to kind of come back to the resilience of the EU institutions, and the sort of institutions you've talked about, the multilateral trade, the WTO. I mean, people have been talking about the weaknesses and strengths, and that these things have to be preserved, and we have to preserve the rules-based order. We all agree with that. But really, how can we refresh that agenda? And is this current set of crises going to sort of take us to sort of say we've got to go back to those things, or is there an opportunity to modernize and rethink the resilience of those? So perhaps go to you first, Denis.
Well, our sense of this has been for some time now that if we want to, as I said, shore up the rules-based system, it's going to require reforming it in at a pretty fundamental level. It's very clear that without deep reform, systemic reforms, the erosion of the system is continuing. And it is not. It has already reached a very significant degree of erosion, in our view. Take the US-China relationship. A big part of it is already, in a sense, operating outside of the rules-based framework, since the trade measures and countermeasures between the two sides, which, by the way, affect third-country jurisdictions, and which are not in line with either the US or China's WTO commitments. Take the weaponization of trade and the phenomenon of economic coercion that we're seeing more and more, which is again a power-based exploitation of interdependencies in a way which is clearly a breach, in our view, not just of international economic law, the law of the WTO, but in some cases a breach of international public law more generally. So the erosion is deep. The WTO's dispute settlement system, which is in a way the core pillar, which is essential because it's a jewel in the crown of that international governance system, has been paralyzed for years now because of the paralysis of the appellate body of the WTO, of the dispute settlement system. That's why we have tried ourselves to put some stopgap arrangements in place, because we simply cannot accept to have something as central as this ceasing to operate. Why? Because if you don't have binding enforceable dispute settlement, you will have inevitably the temptation to start not applying the rules, and progressively the system will be chipped away at. So I think that's the reality. I think the solution is to look at this in the eye, not be naive about the reality of that situation, and being able to consider the sort of fundamental reforms that are proportionate to the extent of the problems that the systems face. You know, in the context of, or in the aftermath of these succession of crises and tensions that we have seen, it's inevitable that you're going to have in the next few years a combination of increased pressures for protection, and therefore with that the risk, frankly, of increasing protectionist tendencies. I do the enforcement of our trade agreements. I see this in many of our partner jurisdictions. EU's interests, economic interests, confront protectionist policies, import substitution policies, left, right, and center. We also are going to have an increased call, probably not necessarily for just protection, but also for more precaution. Protection of the consumer, if you want, in this sort of world where some of the public opinions feel threatened by globalization. Now, response to that is it requires inevitably having more international regulatory cooperation, because if you have greater demands for precaution by civil societies and citizens, the states will regulate. If they do not cooperate internationally in terms of the way they regulate, the way they create regulatory interfaces between their regulatory models, you will have more trade and investment tensions down the line. Third, you will have, in the aftermath of a crisis, we've seen this, it's certainly the case in Europe, greater government intervention in the economies. There is certainly much greater government intervention in the economies, at least in the global north today, than there was before the pandemic. Now, that's not in itself a problem, but of course it can be a problem if it leads to things such as a subsidy race to the bottom, which also has potentially trade and investment spillover effects. So I think it's about being attuned to these changes and making sure that you have the baseline systems of governance and of international cooperation between states that allow to absorb these changes. I think we see that there will be a certain degree of decoupling. It's evident that there is a zone, in particular the zone where you have this interface between trade and investment integration on one hand, and national security considerations on the other hand, where there will be some degree of decoupling. In the EU, we have developed over the last 2 years a framework for cooperation between the member states of the European Union on screening foreign direct investment for security and public order reasons. It's just a necessity. It is a fact that there are issues around public order and security linked to trade and investment that you've got to tackle as a jurisdiction. Now, that doesn't mean that you should make the mistake of turning this into an industrial policy.
Yeah.
So that's the kind of balance which I think we're going to try to continue to push for, whilst being, I would say, intensely realistic about the difficulties of the world in which we operate our international economic relations. And it's not because we're going to have some zones of decoupling that we're going to see a wholesale level of decoupling. I think we're going to see a big box where the international economy remains deeply integrated and increasingly integrated, and a smaller box where the decoupling does take place because it is based on genuine considerations of security and of certain form of state competition that will be inevitable. But the challenge will be to keep the size of the boxes in the right place and in the right way.
Yeah. So Helen, just turning to you, how are financial institutions going to respond to this decoupling? How do you see financial markets, financial products, financial institutions starting to respond to that decoupling we've been talking about today?
I think as of now, we see very little, alternative to actually, completely isolate China itself from the dollar system. I think that there is the Chinese system of payment that there are more than 600 commercial banks that are, and branches that are participating. But compared to the SWIFT system, which has more than 11,000 participating banks, it's just a very small start. I think Russia has been suggesting that they could switch to using yuan and also using this particular payment system. But unfortunately, I just don't necessarily think hardware or software-wise that China's alternative is really feasible for large-scale trade financing or settlement. So in terms of domestic financial institutions, the Chinese banks are actually more funded domestically. So none of the major banks have to seek funding overseas. And therefore, it's largely a domestic system. The connection, however, is through current account or capital account transactions. And I think that most of these banks are still these big five banks, as well as the medium-sized shareholding banks, are very much keeping close to their chest the connection with the rest of the world. So I don't necessarily think that they are actively seeking to look for an alternative at the moment yet.
I wanted to explore two other issues before we open it up for questions. The first is this question of diversification you've all talked about. And I guess there's a kind of fine line between diversification and nationalism. That we're seeing this growing trend to sort of want to produce things end to end in particular countries. Get all of you to respond to this sense of a trend. Certainly here in Australia, we've got quite an active debate about sovereign capability, about have we dropped the ball on manufacturing? Have we let far too much go to global supply chains? How much is that happening in other jurisdictions? Maybe Emily, start with the US. I know it's a very active debate in the US, this whole question of renationalize, re-onshoring a whole lot of production, albeit economically probably unrealistic. How active is that conversation?
Yeah, Jennifer, I think it is very active. And I think, in terms of the political parties in the US, we've seen that trend on both sides. We've seen that message on both the left and the right, and pushing the party, each of the parties, I think, to kind of more extremes, but that's they share that common platform. And to Denise's point, and as you said, Jennifer, it is, it is a fine line, and that's in my view not the answer. So as the Bretton Woods Committee, we sort of work to say no, I think diversification and economic integration is the better way, and we need to address, as Denise said, some of the challenges that we've faced. I think kind of the whole conversation around the benefits of economic integration has people have really not experienced that, and I think that's why we're having this conversation, at least in the U.S., is that people don't see the benefits. So we need to address some of the challenges that we face, and I think we need to address some of these difficult questions that we've been talking about in terms of the rules-based order, and is it still fit for purpose, and does it function in a modern society? And right now, I think the answer is we're seeing very clearly that it is not. So now is the moment, in my view, to really be bold and to start addressing some of those structural issues, and creating a framework going forward that is going to better serve the global population.
Denise, come back to you. I mean, how much is this nationalism, not just economic, but political debate starting to play out in Europe?
Look, on this question of the discussion about the need for strategic autonomy and sovereignty, and in relation to that, to some degree, the forces of populism that we do experience in parts of Europe. Our sense, again, out of the EU institutions, is that it all starts, and it's got to be based on a proper, measured, rational assessment of this question of supply chain resilience and or vulnerabilities. Because what we take away from the last few years' experience, first of all, is that supply chains were actually globally overall resilient during the pandemic, or rather, to put it another way, the pandemic was not a crisis of global value chains. As a matter of fact, they adapted over time and actually exhibited a fair amount of resilience. I think that's one of the findings of the analytical chapter of the IMF's World Economic Outlook that was released last week on this issue. And we're very much in agreement from a government standpoint with that analysis and that literature. It has led us, and we did this about a year ago, to reviewing those strategic dependencies. And interestingly, we did this at the same time as many other jurisdictions, I think, were doing the same. This is the time when the United States, the Biden government, issued a number of executive orders precisely that had led various agencies to undertake a review of supply chain vulnerabilities. Now, what we found in that review of supply chain vulnerabilities, looking at, if you want, the more strategic ecosystems in our economy, looking at our trade relationship and dependency, we found that the part of the external trade of the EU where we are at risk because there is a very high concentration of imports from one or perhaps two suppliers on one hand, and where the possibilities for diversification or the possibilities for domestic production at an acceptable cost, this part is this share of our external economic relations is very, very small, actually. We've looked at thousands of products. Looking through these kinds of filters, we find 34 products out of 5,000 where in reality we see this problem of high import dependency and difficulty to respond through diversification. That's less than 1% of our total extra EU import. So it's, for those products, it's a real issue, and that you do need to have a public policy response, be it stockpiling, be it through procurement, be it through regulation where necessary. But that is only going to be, it has to be put in its right place and its right dimension. It's a very small part of how we are integrated in the global economy. That's why we believe that our approach to strategic autonomy needs to be an open strategic autonomy based on openness, because we need to import to export, because we need to continue to connect as European countries to the global sources of growth, and there is no substitute for that than to be integrated through trade and investment linkages.
Helen, do you want to make a very brief comment on that? And then I want to very quickly turn to the Indo-Pacific with just one very simple question. And then I'll hand over to Emily for questions from participants. Helen, very brief comment on this question of nationalism versus diversification.
Yeah, I think that for China, the option is probably more as a matter of completing its value chain. Is it for practical matters because that they obviously foresee that there could be the risk that one day that if China is being sanctioned directly or indirectly, and some kind of a component would not be made available for imports, and then the whole country could come to a stall. So I think from such a perspective, you can say that this is probably for pragmatic reasons, that they need to make this value chain complete, so that they need to produce everything that they need to use. But at the same time, you can also say that this is probably more political, as we do not necessarily imagine that such a day would come. After the Russia-Ukrainian crisis, I think such risks have become more realistic. And therefore, I think that the emphasis on manufacturing sector, especially high-end manufacturing sector, has become indeed further, prioritized by top decision makers, because they want to make sure that China would not be, pushed to a pause, just because that there is some country who may not necessarily say that they want to, they could export the certain product to China.
So just very brief question to all of you. We've got a minute before I hand over to Emily for questions from the participants. But has the West dropped the ball on the Indo-Pacific? If we just kind of orientate ourselves for a minute, have we dropped the ball here? Is this the next frontier where we're going to have to try and modernize and stabilize these multilateral relationships or develop new multilateral relationships? Is it realistic for the EU to kind of bring collective will together to make sure that the Indo-Pacific stays strong, is kind of economically interdependent? We've just seen, obviously, something of great concern to Australia, the Solomons, China, economic arrangements that have been agreed this week. Very brief comment from all of you, and we will need to be brief. Has the West dropped the ball? Is this the next big frontier that we should all be thinking about? Emily, start with you.
I'd actually like to hear your answer to that, Jennifer.
I think the answer is yes, absolutely. And I think, but I don't think the old structures are going to be the solution to the problem.
Yeah, I'd agree with that, but I defer to Denis and Helen on this.
Helen?
Well, I actually was about to say that I very much think that what you said is true. The problem, however, is that I think people nowadays first impose a structure on something, and probably a politically driven structure, and then think that economic flows will happen. It may not happen that quickly.
Yeah, Denis?
Indo-Pacific, very important for the EU. I would just say, first of all, that one should not underestimate actually the current footprint that we have in the Indo-Pacific.
Yes.
The EU, in particular, as a trade and investment bloc, we have vast networks of agreements, either negotiated or under negotiation with key countries in the Indo-Pacific. We are the top investor, we're the leading development cooperation partner, and we want to maximize the benefits from those existing linkages. We see that this is a zone where there is intense geopolitical competition that's adding tensions to trade and supply chain linkages. That's why there was clearly a policy decision here to look at the Indo-Pacific in a more integrated manner. We adopted in September last year a strategy for the Indo-Pacific. There are different components to this. We will have to work in different ways through different instruments, trade, non-trade. On trade, I would say continuing to work through the traditional trade agreements that we have been negotiating and putting on the books recently, but also looking at region-to-region type agreements as well going forward with ASEAN, for example. So I think the menu needs to become more diversified. Indeed, because Helen says you can't have a sort of political one-size-fits-all view that you're going to impose and that you think is going to really govern the international economic relations in a place where changes are fast and where the intensity of the relationships is constantly growing.
No, I think that's absolutely right. Well, Emily, let me hand back over to you to just facilitate our Q&A from the participants.
Yeah, thank you. We do have a couple of good audience questions. So first, I want to go to Yuan Zhang, who has a question for Denis. If you could go ahead and unmute your microphone and pose your question. There we go.
Hello.
Perfect.
Hello.
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for your for inviting. And I have a question for Denis. It's for the EU economy. So I wonder, will EU ban the import of natural gas from Russia. And what is the pay for this? How much is the pay for the import sanction, do you think? That's my question. Thank you.
Can I take that? You're taking several questions. How do we do this?
Why don't we go one at a time? Why don't you go ahead and respond?
No, the question of what further steps are going to be taken in terms of economic sanctions towards Russia is, of course, something which is under political consideration inside the EU. I would say that it's very clear that the tightening of the sanctions regime is likely to happen because of simply of the situation on the ground in terms of Russia's aggression of Ukraine. Now, the deeper we go into the economic sanction, into that decoupling, the greater the effect is going to be. It's very clear that the question of energy imports is the most difficult question because it's a significant part of Russia's exports revenue, but it's also a significant part of our economic links on the import side today. The EU and the allies have already stepped into the issue of energy imports in the context of sanctions. We've banned the imports of coal in the fifth sanctions package, and nothing is off the table, whether it's in terms of oil or perhaps further down the line in terms of gas. Now, I'm not habilitated to comment on where we're going to go in terms of such a political decision, which is a decision on sanctions. But it's very clear that the level of economic decoupling is likely to grow, and the sanctions are likely to be sustained. I think you should not make any mistake in terms of how serious this is, and that's why I was talking about, in a way, a form of economic statecraft. I would also add that if you take into account the cumulative effect of the sanctions we've adopted so far, they're very significant, not just in terms of shutting off Russia's revenue streams by limiting or restricting imports into the EU, but also the effects of the sanctions that we're taking on the export side, whether it is in terms of export bans or export restrictions, both in terms of limiting the exports of G7 exports of technology that goes into the civil military machine or beyond. Do not underestimate the strength over time of the economic sanctions on the export side that have already been taken in terms of that capacity to disrupt the Russian economy, unfortunately, going forward, because this is the sort of effect that we need to be having. We have put in place, in a way, an autonomous export control regime vis-a-vis an entire economy among a number of allies. It's a very significant new development in that area. And when it comes to restrictions of our export towards Russia, you need to be aware, for example, that 25% of our exports pre-war are under sanctions, and the EU's exports last year to Russia were to the tune of 80 billion euros, which is not exactly nothing.
Thanks, Denis. I'm going to turn to Lyric Hale now. Could you go ahead and unmute your microphone and pose your question?
Yes, thank you.
Hi, yes.
Am I unmuted now?
Yes,
can you hear me now?
Ahead.
Yes, my question is, what will be the effect of the bifurcation that you're talking about on the corporate world, multinational corporations? Many US corporations depend on China, for example, not just for manufacturing, but for markets. So how will this play out in equity markets, for example? And I guess part of the answer will depend on the duration of what's going on, but it seems like this is a durable trend. So how will multinational corporations and also the people who invest in them be affected? Thank you.
Helen, you want to take that? And Jennifer, feel free to jump in as well.
Sure. I don't think there is an easy answer for this. In fact, we're starting to see the beginning of that. I think some international corporations decided to move along to serve both type of markets, and with completely two different type of product lines. So for example, if you were a apparel company, then serving the market outside of China means that you probably don't necessarily want to use any cotton from Xinjiang province. But at the same time, if you serve the Chinese market, then you probably couldn't avoid using the cotton from Xinjiang province. Otherwise, the local consumers would think that you actually meant to do something. So I think that this is a simple example trying to imply that the complication for product mixes will probably increase if you decide to serve both markets. And at the same time, for operation purposes, right? And whether you keep the supply chain in China or not, I think that a lot of localization would be very much needed. I think the recent COVID situation and the COVID-related restrictions are very much testing how localized a company can be in the face of such significant and almost draconian measures. But overall speaking, from taking a step back, just as an economist, I would say that while our job is not necessarily to make recommendations on for investors to invest in equities stocks, we, however, see that as true that if countries are not necessarily going to be free to use its comparative advantage to its full, instead we let the farmers teach their own children, and we let the teachers grow their own food. It's probably not the most ideal way or the most efficient way of allocating resources globally. So, just from an economic point of view, I do think that the two sets of standards and two sets of systems may not necessarily be the most efficient way to handle this, but as Jennifer and Emily and Denny basically alluded to, that this may not necessarily be avoidable in the near future.
I think that's right. I think it's a fantastic question, and I think it's extremely difficult to see how multinationals can avoid this, because if you're looking for growth, you can't actually diversify away completely from one of the biggest growth opportunities in history. So if you are actually interested in your returns to shareholders, the idea that you can choose between these two markets, I think, is just completely unrealistic. But it's incredibly inefficient and going to be a very difficult path to navigate. Here in Australia, more and more companies talk about diversifying in addition to, but very few talk about diversification away from.
Thank you both. We have one final question from Mahesh Koteka. I'm going to go to Mahesh, and I think he has a good concluding question for us for the panel. Mahesh? Mahesh, can you unmute? All right. Having a little trouble with his audio. I have his question here, though, and I am going to ask it to our panelists. His question is, how far and how long, possibly quantitatively, can reshoring, friendshoring policy go before we sacrifice global growth? And how bad will it be for least developed countries? He says, you've seen the collapse of tourism and the sanctions on Russia push Sri Lanka into debt default. So let's talk a little bit about how these policies are going to impact developing countries. And I'll let each of the panelists take it. Denis, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, a couple of thoughts maybe on this. As I said, I think that on the how far, how long will you have reshoring, I don't believe that you're going to have wholesale reshoring, and it makes no sense. And I explain why, if you look rationally at this trading bloc like the EU, and therefore its economic operators and governments have no reason to consider these kinds of nationalistic policies. I think, though, that obviously there is a trade-off which is at play right now between efficiency and risk. And I think that it's not just a question of policy. I have the impression, again, I'm perhaps not from a government standpoint best place to comment on this, but I have the impression that already, even outside of any kind of policy or political reason for doing so, there has been from internationalized companies and operators a certain degree already of revisiting or reassessing of risk. And so I think those adjustments are already to some extent taking place. And I think this is in that sense that I think global value chains are constantly adapting, and therefore, because they're adapting, might be able to cushion more brutal readjustments. On the question of how much that impacts, I think, developing countries, I think there will be a lot of differences, because you will have a number of emerging economies very integrated into global supply chains today that might have actually more costly impacts. If you look at least developed countries, I would say not so much, unfortunately, precisely because they have not been able to benefit until now enough of the a proper integration in the global economy. So I think there's a huge question of differentiation within the global south in terms of how these impacts are going to play out, no doubt.
Yeah, and we're just at time. So Helen, Jennifer, any final comments before we wrap up?
Well, I think it will be more talked about than done. I think people will talk a lot about onshoring. I think they'll talk a lot about sovereign capability, but I think markets will make those trade-offs between efficiency and risk, as Denis has said.
I would just add that I think it largely depends on what type of world we're facing tomorrow. If we're facing a very volatile environment and occasionally being scarred by war, then probably it makes more sense for more companies to think about diversity. It doesn't necessarily have to be war, related. It could be pandemic related. But I think that if we're facing a world that is more eventful, we probably will see stronger incentives for this to last for longer.
Thanks, Helen. And on that note, we will wrap up. I want to thank all of our panelists for joining us today, and Jennifer for expertly moderating our discussion. I was no substitute for John Drake. Unfortunately, we couldn't get him today, but thank you very much for being here and for a really good discussion. And thanks to our audience for good questions. I thought that those were really, really good questions. Just a reminder to our audience, we'll continue our annual meeting this afternoon, 3 p.m. Eastern time, with a conversation with IMF Managing Director Kristalina Georgieva and our very own John Lipsky. So hope to see you all back here. So thanks again, everyone, for joining us. Have a good one.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.